Thank you all for coming this evening, and welcome. My name is Stephen Whiteman. I'm lecturer in Asian art history at the University of Sydney and deputy director of the Power Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the opening of Gender in Southeast Asian Art History since tonight's keynote lecture. I would like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous owners of the land upon which we are gathered, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is on their land that the University of Sydney is built. I offer my respects to Indigenous elders, past, present, and future. During the various events associated with gender in Southeast Asia art over the coming days, we, the conveners, would like to expand upon this customary acknowledgement of country by introducing a different individual from local Indigenous history to you, often, though not always, an Eora person or someone from Eora land. We are doing so in an effort to recognize and celebrate the validity of Indigenous knowledges, particularly as we come together in this place to share our own research and knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is one of many forms of knowledge elided or denigrated by dominant cultures. As this symposium is very much concerned with the ways in which this process of denial operates around gender, we feel that such recognition is particularly important. We also hope that these introductions will be useful for our national and international guests participating in the symposium who may be less familiar with Sydney's Aboriginal history. In this vein, I would like to briefly tell you about Pearl May Gibbs, a local Indigenous rights activist and leader. Gibbs's mother's family was of the Nagemba or Murwari language, which means that her mother's family came from outside Eora country in north-central New South Wales. Gibbs, born in La Perouse, which is in southern Sydney, in 1908, grew up in rural New South Wales, but returned to Sydney as a young woman to work in domestic service. There she met Indigenous women who had been removed from their families and indentured by the Aborigines Protection Board, an experience that began Gibbs's career as an advocate for Indigenous peoples. Over her lifetime, she was particularly active around issues of women's and children's rights, problems of public health, exploitative labor practices, and sexual assault perpetrated against Aboriginal women, and for Aboriginal rights in general. Serving in the Aborigines Progressive Association, the Committee for Aboriginal Citizenship, and the Council for Aboriginal Rights, among other foundational national organizations for Indigenous issues, she also worked locally in Dubbo, where she moved after World War II, establishing a medical hostel for the area's Indigenous community. Although many of her greatest political concerns disproportionately affected Aboriginal women, through her work, Gibbs also recognized a larger issue that will be raised in various contexts over the course of the next 3 days, namely the practical exclusion of women from conversations and debates through the contexts in which such discussions were held. In the case of mid-20th century Australia, for Gibbs, often the pub or other zones less open to women. Perhaps as a result, Gibbs sought to ally the Aboriginal rights movement with other progressive movements of her time, including women's rights and trade unions. And it is in this vein that we expand our acknowledgments of country over the course of this event. So it is with great pleasure, I will move through this very quickly, but it is with great pleasure that I am able to welcome you, and I have the privilege to welcome all of you to what I hope will be 2 and 3 days of really wonderful conversation and enriching debate, and I expect very interesting talks on art, with which we begin tonight with Professor Thompson. I am not in charge of introducing Professor Thompson or really of anybody else, but I do want to briefly thank, on behalf of all the conveners, something that you'll hear a lot of thanks in the next few days. But I do really briefly want to thank all the people who made, or many of the people who made this whole event possible. First and foremost, the conveners of this symposium, the indomitable and wonderful Claire, Roger, and Yvonne, without whom none of this would be happening. And it really is hugely terrific, and it's been my privilege to help them along the way. I also want to thank the Power Institute, who supported this project from the start, whose funding was the seed that gave the rest of the project life, and especially CF, the Sydney Southeast Asian Center, whose support made bringing Professor Thompson to Sydney for this event possible. We also enjoyed very generous support from the Asian Studies Association of Australia, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and the School of Literature, Arts, and Media. And for the event that I'm actually nominally in charge of launching, also NUS Press, the publisher of Southeast of Now, which is the wonderful journal that we are about to move into very, very quickly. A few other quick things. Mark Ledbury, Mimi Kelly, Marnie Williams, Vicky Malik, and Susan Thomas of Power, Tashara Dibley and Elizabeth Kramer from SEAC, and a huge thanks to Georgia Holmes, who I don't see from the school, who on the fly made our facilities situation a whole lot better. Thank you very much to all of you. Now I want to give away very quickly to John Clark, my colleague John Clark, and to Yvonne Lowe, to launch the second issue of Southeast of Now. But I do want to say very briefly, because it's Sydney and I get to sort of spruik Sydney a little bit while I'm here at the mic, that I think the journal that we're coming to start the evening with, starting this event with, is just a remarkable publication that has been built by what is very much the sort of the huge grassroots interest and motivation and hard work of young scholars in the region. Southeast of Now is a journal that I have myself no contact with, except being lucky enough to be friends with and colleagues with many of the members of the editorial board. But it is a journal that has brought important issues in its very short life so far, but what will be a very long life, and I'm sure has brought important issues to the fore in the study of art in the region. And I guess that it would only be right of me representing Power to say that we feel a great deal of pleasure, take a great deal of pride in the sort of some of the reflected glory. A lot of this event and many of the members of SEON, Southeast of Now, we've had the privilege to work with through a Getty Grant Ambitious Alignments with Histories of Southeast Asian Art over the last couple of years. Please come in. And get a glass of wine if you want before we sit down. The window is fading. This is your moment. And we consider ourselves at Power as the University of Sydney extraordinarily fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with so many of the participants and to support in whatever way we can, including through a conference such as this, or launch such as this, support whatever we can the study of art in the region. And so, that's more than enough for me. I would like to therefore hand over the mic to the man who will launch the journal this evening, a man who I think all of you know very well, my predecessor, John Clark, Professor Emeritus of Asian Art at the University of Sydney.
It's a great pleasure to introduce the second issue of Southeast of Now. This is due to great support through the region, including the Cultural Centre of the University of Malaya, the National University of Singapore Press, and many others whom Yvonne Lowe will mention shortly. But now it is worth reflecting on the situation which gave birth to the first issue. Looking from the inside of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art history outwards, firstly, there was no journal devoted to this field. Secondly, the creative art historical work often had to seek an offshore outlet for publication. Thirdly, art historical analysis, so far as it commented on the structure of knowledge and the art market, had to argue with bureaucratic inertia coupled with nationalist discourses at home, as well as a climate of art critical analysis which was set in terms of the market and the needs of art collectors. In other words, inside Southeast Asia, the discourse was frequently self-referential and often national cultural based. Escaping from well-known operational positions to generate new knowledge in the art world was difficult and likely to be circumscribed by national boundaries, or by the various kinds of impediment, sometimes just ideological jostling, but also amounting to censorship in some cases, which meant that the horizontal links between art historians across the region could not always be established. Now, inside the region, many things have changed through the efforts of senior scholars, I just mentioned, our friend T.K. Sarvapati, among others, and artists who have persisted over 20 or 30 years in getting modern art history established and local critical notions of the contemporary into circulation. If we now turn around and look at this journal from the outside, from over there, not over here, as the book recently titled itself, Northeast Asian and South Asian phenomena, with exceptions, are no longer the rule-bearing exemplars, as one might find, for example, within the pages of Third Text or Yishu, the Journal of Chinese Contemporary Art. They act as models for excellence and appropriate ways of analysis. Nor are the important features of size of markets, number of museums, longevity of modern art histories, density of the linkages with Euro-America, and so forth, really dominating external reception of modern contemporary Southeast Asian art anymore. We're not doing it anymore, but of course the situation is highly ambiguous still. This is healthy and is praiseworthy, since it means that at least the intellectual and artistic constraints on horizontal interregional linkages have been loosened. Whatever the economic and political consequences of globalism have been, and I suspect this relaxation is partly due to the insatiable demand of the Biennale circuit and the expanded desire of museums of contemporary art for the spectacular exotic, just look at the staircase in the MCA, for example, or plain, or demand for something new. New is a very old concept. This increase has opened up spaces for difference, even though we must be wary of new kinds of transnational conformity all around in museums these days. At least insofar as such international flows on the local sites can allow difference to appear as artworks or as interregional horizontality and flows of artworks as art practices and mentalities, this is much more feasible than hitherto. Southeast of now, with its sighting in an academic publisher in Singapore, is a major improvement. Thank you again, National University of Singapore Press, to put their neck out against the National Gallery of Singapore, some of you will know. Since there is identifiably now a place where each part of the region can develop knowledge about art, which is in itself in flow between parts of the region. It also allows us to compensate for the understandable, but in the outcome unfortunate experience of the national, where the vain, excuse me, this is my Prayut phrase here, where the vain dream of monoethnicity, state ideology and culture and religious centeredness have occluded many kinds of art and artists who have already some time ago gone beyond these limitations. A brief examination of the list of recent PhDs shows how different the situation in knowledge certification has been since the 1990s, when the US PhDs of Boshanon, Wright, Kate, Taylor and others appeared, just to name a few. And we have lots of people now in the first issue of this journal and now in the second issue. My only plea, suggestion to the editors, which I hope will take on board, is to consider publishing lists of all these past theses which they consider relevant. I mean, there are many bits of work out there which we haven't seen referred to, which we don't know exist, and it would be very important to have a list of those. It is wonderful that the second cohort of younger scholars, now present among you here, has provided the organisation and knowledge for the new journal. If this journal functions for them, it'll work pretty well for a broader art-interested public in the region, and who knows, some other intellectuals. I dare say including officials and political classes may now become more interested in art and art ideas. In other words, as against the 1990s, when a handful of chiefly North American institutions were producing and certifying knowledge in this field, more than the same volume of work has been done in the last 5 years across a wide range of local institutions. The various linking up art history projects of the Power Institute and Getty Foundation should ensure that this number magnifies again, and we know about the very important program at SOAS as well, and will include so many more specialists trained and certified within the region, or for the region itself. Speaking here in Sydney, whose population is roughly 1/4 Asian, 1/4 roughly, it is clear in art and art history that this includes Australia too.
as you say. We waited a long time for this. Matemaste, as they say in Kabuki. The arrival of the second edition of the journal can appear to be serendipitous, with new exhibitions of Southeast Asian contemporary art now open at the Mori Art Museum in Tokyo and the Asia Society in New York, just opening this week. It is significant that contemporary Southeast Asian art now receives much better international recognition, since complaint was heard, I think in the New York Times, among other places, that there were too many names to remember in the press sections, to press reactions to traditions tensions in 1996. Too many names, too many artists. Well, what do you expect? Well, they didn't expect that, that's the point. External recognition is good, yet we must always hope for stronger and more profound local recognition from our intellectual and artistic peers within the region. I think we can say that Southeast of Now #2 amply replies to those expectations. And
I'll pay for it, please. Don't forget it.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, for the great support and for so generously launching the journal again. This too is also my second time speaking about the journal at this launch as one of the 9 editorial members currently. And I like to think that this is a second chance for me to redeem myself, to properly share with everyone how this journal came to, however boring Roger might think it would be, and to properly thank Roger for making this journal happen, not to undermine the collective and its collective effort in saying that, but just to underscore his leadership and vision that is shared by the collective. So for those of you who have read our first issue, which came out this year in March, you would no doubt recall the idea of establishing a journal for discussing art in Southeast Asia was first expressed in the storage grounds of the EFEO in Siem Reap, Cambodia. Now, when that exactly took place, I do not know, but Roger would definitely do. But a year later, after much sweat and tears, discussion and consultation, the Southeast of Now website was officially launched and its vision formally unveiled. I'd like to take a minute just to read a section of it here. The global discourse of contemporary and modern art remains stubbornly asymmetrical, with many contexts for discussion oriented to the North and the West, and also to the new and the now. Resisting the pressure to be always up to date and forever new, the journal instead values the historicizing of recent practices from the 19th century and before to the present and after. We further announce our purview as contemporary and modern art, a reversal of the usual order, in a deliberate gesture to destabilize assumptions of a teleological progression from a time or times referred to as the modern to one or many we call the contemporary. Manifesto like this provocation to resist the pressure to be in, to destabilize off-cited views, may sound lofty, ambitious, and smack of idealism. Idealism and passion are probably the 2 words that would best describe the collective attitude. I've been speaking of the collective here in third person, as I was not part of the original team, but was invited to join together with Eileen Ramirez at a later stage. We nonetheless share this vision and are cognizant of the glaring gap in the scholarly production of research and writing in Southeast Asian art, especially within the region itself, where the discipline of art history is still by and large nascent, if not foreign. When we joined, the team was well past its initial gestation phase, with its original plan of putting together an electronic journal cast into the wind when Junya, one of the original editorial members but who has since left, brought NUS Press into the picture. It was a dream come true, obviously, for us lot, to have a prestigious publisher buy into our vision. Every cloud, indeed, has a silver lining. The structural support provided by NUS Press has made all the difference in the world for us rookies. We are deeply grateful to both Peter Chopet and Pallavi Narayan for their professional advice and tireless editorial support, but more importantly, for believing in us and for investing in this endeavor. They gave us, the editorial committee, full rein to make all content-related decisions, whilst managing the ever-important marketing and administrative aspects that would certainly do us all in. We could not have asked for a better partnership. For this inaugural volume, the editorial team decided on the theme, discomfort, inviting submissions to consider this amorphous thing however desired. On our part, we are mindful that this region we call Southeast Asia, its geographical boundaries, its internal borders, its deployment as a concept, its politicization, and consequent instrumentalization can result in discomforts both in terms of methods of research and objects of inquiry. The essays included in both issues, we hope, are evident not only of the productive register that the theme had brought forth, but also the openness to which it was interpreted. And to this end, we are immensely grateful to our contributors for their insightful and original perspectives. For this issue at least, 3 essays have dealt with aspects of gender that would surely be of interest to us all attending the Gender in Southeast Asian Art Histories Symposium. So on behalf of my fellow editors here with us, Roger Nelson and Aline Ramirez, I would also like to acknowledge the Cultural Center at the University of Malaya as our supporting institution, and to extend our thanks and appreciation to 2 of the advisors of Southeast of Now, also present here, Emeritus Professor John Clark and Professor Ashley Thompson, as well as the contributors of the current issue that we are launching today, Matt Cox, Claire View, and Fiona Lee. Fiona Lee, yes. Okay, and so thank you again for coming. We hope you have enjoyed the wine as well as the canapes. And just to also let you know that it's available for sale today and for the rest of the symposium. Should you wish to purchase a copy, it's $28, which is, I think it's a pretty fair price. All right, so I'll hand the mic over now to my compatriot, Roger. Yes.
Thank you, Yvonne, and thank you everyone for coming. Maybe we should turn the lights down now to the low setting so that Ashley's slides show up a bit better. So for those who don't know, my name is Roger Nelson. I'm one of the co-conveners of this gathering, along with Stephen, who you met, Yvonne, who you met, and Claire Veal. And it's my great honour and my great pleasure to introduce our very special guest keynote speaker for tonight, Professor Ashley Thompson. I did have a list of thank yous, but Stephen has already run through them all. But I would just like to underscore our thanks to the Asian Studies Association of Australia, who provided us with a grant that really made it possible for us to begin conceptualising this gathering, in addition to all of the supporters within the University of Sydney who Stephen has named. So, Professor Ashley Thompson is the Harem Woodward Chair in Southeast Asian Art at SOAS, formerly the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. In addition to tonight's keynote lecture, Thompson will be with us for the remainder of this week for tomorrow's all-day symposium, many of which I assume many of you will be attending, as well as for other internal discussions on Friday. Professor Thompson is a singularly respected leader in a daunting number of scholarly fields, many of which are rarely otherwise in much contact with one another. These include, most notably, Cambodian and Southeast Asian art, archaeology and cultural history, of all periods from the pre-Angkorian, that is before the 9th century, right up to the 21st century. And within this staggering historical sweep, spanning the so-called pre-modern to the so-called contemporary, she also considers a great breadth of contextual frames, including the ritual, the religious, and the expeditionary, among others. She examines artworks, objects, and texts as they are found, used and circulated across numerous disparate settings, from temples to colonial accounts to biennales and beyond. These qualities, this inquisitiveness, are exceedingly rare in the field. Thompson's work also engages with area studies, with Theravada Buddhist studies of various kinds, I should say, with what is now called, rather awkwardly, cultural heritage management, and also, and always, with the intersection of each of these various areas of inquiry with the post-structuralist deconstructive method, with psychoanalysis, and with feminism. Thompson writes and publishes in English, French, and Khmer, and before coming to the UK via both France and the US, where she was born, Thompson was in the archaeology department at Cambodia's Royal University of Fine Arts for much of the 1990s. There, she taught in Khmer as just one among her numerous collaborative and research-based contributions to the place and people who have been at the centre of her intellectual work for well over 2 decades. Thompson's work offers a singular example of intertwinings, the binding together of theory and practice, history and philosophy, the disciplined and the interdisciplinary, the textual and the visual, the aesthetic and the religious and the political, among others. But now I want to turn away from talking about Professor Thompson for a moment. Stephen has already acknowledged the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations as the indigenous owners of the land on which we meet. And I would like, before I continue to say more about Professor Thompson, I would like to turn our attention away for a moment to introduce another very impressive and important woman. Her name was Barangaroo, and she was born around the middle of the 18th century. And I hope that what I say about her will lead us back into what I have to say about Professor Thompson in time. So Barangaroo was among the most significant and powerful figures in the early history of Sydney, immediately following British invasion in 1788. She was from Sydney's North Harbour, the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, now known as the suburb of Manly, so named incidentally by the British captain Arthur Phillip in a tribute to what he called the, quote, confidence and manly behaviour of the indigenous people who he found there. Barangaroo was very likely present at the first meeting between her people and the British invaders in February 1788. She first officially met with British officers in 1790, and they described her in their written accounts as both striking and frightening. Perhaps those of you who live in Sydney may be already familiar with Barangaroo, but many of our national and international guests and symposium participants may not be. And certainly, she is nowhere near as celebrated and well known as her second husband, a man named Bennelong. It was after him that Bennelong Point in the Sydney Harbour was named, the place on which the Sydney Opera House now stands. And it is he, Bennelong, who is credited as having been a key figure for his mediating role, mediating between the Eora people and the British, both here in New South Wales and in the colonial centre in England. Barangaroo disapproved of Bennelong's closeness with the British. She disapproved of his willingness to serve as a mediator. Her first husband, before Bennelong, had died from smallpox, the smallpox that the British introduced with disastrous effects on indigenous populations. And they introduced it, I should say, at first accidentally, and then with a deliberate murderous intent that many have described as genocide. Barangaroo is an important figure in the history of the Eora land on which Sydney stands, although her importance has been overshadowed by that of her husband, in history and in popular discourse. This is, of course, inescapably related to her gender, but I suspect it also has to do with her politics, her behaviour, the role she chose to play, and the way that it was described by the British, who were the only people writing anything down at that time. In short, by the manner in which she chose to perform being a woman and to perform being Indigenous. So I've introduced Barangaroo a little less briefly than I might have here, because I think that there are perhaps some parallels to be drawn between the story of Barangaroo, or rather the way that story has been told, retold, and not told, and the kinds of stories and histories that have been written by our keynote speaker, Professor Ashley Thompson. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting any kind of comparison between these two women. Rather, I'm hoping that the story of Barangaroo might lead us to the ways in which Thompson's research has often surfaced instances of friction in history and worked to unsettle common assumptions within the field. and gender, or rather in her preferred terms, sexual difference, has long been at the centre of Thompson's work, even as it otherwise ranges widely across diverse historical and disciplinary terrains. In her most recent publication, a book titled Engendering the Buddhist State and published last year by Routledge, Thompson has written of, and I quote, "the irreducibility of the partnership between history and historiography, the ultimate inadequacy of any initiative to establish the former, that is history, in the absence of critical attention to the latter, that is historiography." And Thompson prosecutes this argument not only at the level of abstraction, but through close readings of Khmer inscriptions, which she approaches both as records of the past and as artefacts from that past, that is, as historical and historiographical together and at once. In 2008, Thompson published an essay written in honour of David Chandler, the preeminent Anglophone historian of modern Cambodia. She wrote her essay in dialogue also with earlier historians of Cambodia and the region. I'd like to read a few lines from the text. Quote, "My hope is to suggest a few more paths for carrying on from where Chandler leads us, and indeed where the historian Paul Moose leaves off at the end of his 1933 essay, India Seen from the East, with the renewed promise of another kind of history, an indigenous history that would not come from the rock or the linga of the chief or the king, but instead from the womenfolk telling stories beside their huts. With these stories," this is still Thompson, "with these stories I aim more specifically to suggest a possible trajectory for pursuing research on an enduring paradox in the historiography of Southeast Asia. While the relatively high status of women in Southeast Asian cultures has often been seen to distinguish the region as a geocultural entity from its looming western and northeastern neighbours, that Southeast Asian history, at least as written by both ancient chroniclers and scholars of the modern international tradition, has given little space to feminine voice." End quote. To say that giving space to feminine voice is at the heart of Thompson's work would be too easy. It would oversimplify the complexity of her thinking and writing, and it would also elide the impossibility of thinking the feminine without also thinking the masculine, the trans, an impossibility which Thompson confronts recurrently and excitingly in her work. But Thompson's work does consistently give space to feminine voice. This is, of course, an important reason why we invited her to give this keynote address, but there were many other reasons also. One, of course, is the rigour with which she engages with methodology, and I've talked about this a bit already. Another is her determination to work transhistorically. Very often in Southeast Asian art, and indeed in Asian art, and I dare say in art history more broadly, scholarship on the pre-modern is kept separate from work on the modern and the contemporary. Thompson insists that these fields could do well to learn from each other, as they are grappling often with very similar concerns, including around scholarship after colonialism. We, that is the conveners, wanted this symposium to attempt to traverse historical periods in its consideration of gender in Southeast Asian art histories. And Thompson is singularly well equipped to navigate with us through this messy terrain. Another reason we were so delighted when Professor Thompson accepted our invitation is her commitment to developing the field, and in particular her very generous championing of what universities like to call early career researchers. She is a famously inspiring and supportive teacher, as I hear often from both her current and her former students. She has been instrumental in implementing a recent donation which has enabled dozens of Southeast Asian nationals to study on full scholarships at SOAS at the University of London. For over a decade, she has co-edited with the Cambodian anthropologist Julian a trilingual journal of Khmer studies called Udaya. It consistently publishes the work of early career researchers alongside senior scholars, writing in English, French, and Khmer. The Udaya journal also publishes translations, and it is on this subject that I will conclude. Thompson first came to Cambodia, she has said, through or by or because of Helene Sixu. I suspect we might hear more about Sixu from her in the coming days. Thompson attended the French feminist writer and philosopher's seminars. She read Sixu's historical epic play, which is titled The Terrible but Unfinished Story of Norodom Sihanouk, King of Cambodia. Soon after, Thompson was working in a Cambodian refugee camp and then teaching in Phnom Penh, and the rest, as they say, is history. Decades later, Thompson led a project to translate Zixu's epic play from French to Khmer. After several years of work, the full 8-hour production by a 32-member Cambodian troupe successfully toured Europe in 2013, including with a 3-week sellout tour at Paris's Théâtre Soleil. The performers came from a school in Battambang, Cambodia, called Phra Ponlu Selapap. This school was founded by former refugees, many of whom Thompson had first met when they were still in a refugee camp. It's a nice circle in history, and one which brings us back to the many intertwinings, including of theory and practice, that Thompson's work brings to us. So with that, it is my privilege and my pleasure to introduce Professor Ashley Thompson, who will speak to us on figuring the Buddha. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm not at all certain I can live up to that, but I appreciate it. I also want to thank Yvonne and Claire and Stephen. I can't really see any of you in the audience, but I'm sure you're here, so thank you all very much for having me here. I'm very touched, and I'm sure I will be inspired also by the next few days. So, Siddhartha Gautama is, to begin with, a model of sovereign monarchical power, but also and inseparably of heteronormative masculine privilege, a princely power and privilege that is represented by a Buddhist canon in patriarchal, phallocratic, and starkly gendered terms. Wife, child, harem, prostitutes, and of course kingdom are his to dispose of as he wishes. So far, so unremarkable. The drama really only begins with an apparent departure from this very cozy norm. In a supremely ambivalent gesture, the future Buddha leaves behind the many subaltern women who literally define his princely existence to seek a new transcendent state. Is this a proto-feminist act, or simply another in the apparently limitless reinventions of phallocentrism? Women are, to begin with, so many foils, the condition of possibility for this model man to surpass himself in attaining perfection. From a psychoanalytic point of view, the historical Buddhist project might be said to be predicated on a generalized sublimation whereby the energy of masculine sexual desire is blocked and yet retained and redirected to other non-sexual or otherwise sexual ends. Of course, we all know where this leads. Sublimation for Freud does not represent a radical break with what went before. Quite to the contrary. Freud's little boy represses his sexual desire for his mother only under a capital threat and only to conform more completely to patriarchal norms. Of course, Siddhartha was not born in fin de siècle Vienna, and the cultural presuppositions involved in the model of sexual development, notably a certain understanding of the nuclear family and parenting modes, have been amply debated and critiqued already in the West, and certainly cannot be said to apply universally. And yet, it is difficult not to see some very familiar and hardly enlightened structures being repeated in the Buddhist story, including a particularly leaden representation of gendered roles as objects of desire and desiring subjects. Women comprise the material, spurring men to the intellectual exploits born of resistance. The type of Buddhism dominating mainland Southeast Asia from the 13th century, Theravada Buddhism, or Tali Buddhism, as it is often now called in scholarly circles, is an unwieldy beast, taking different forms for different people in different places and times. On one exoteric level, however, we can say that Pali Buddhism is organized around the historical Buddha's life story. In this narrative context, figuring the historical Buddha is, I will argue, dependent upon figuring women. In the following, I will highlight a few key episodes of the Buddha's life story which make my point. I will show images from a smattering of Southeast Asian contexts to demonstrate that the Buddha's life story serves to give a fundamental structure and cohesion to Pali Buddhist culture, broadly speaking, even as Pali Buddhist cultures can differ significantly when examined more closely. A few of my Angkorian examples come from a Sanskrit Buddhist or a Mahayana context. The story spans traditions, and certain scenes have proved recurrent across the historical evolution of Buddhist art in Cambodia as it consolidated into Theravada. A few of my modern examples explicitly attest to intra-regional circulation of imagery, which no doubt builds on the long tradition of Buddhist artwork, providing an object-based lingua franca across the region. Displayed in temple grounds, these are collective or official modes of representation. Nonetheless, as tonight's talk will ultimately focus on Cambodian materials, I've selected scenes which feature among a handful singled out for recurrent representation in Cambodian Buddhist art over time. We have relatively limited narrative materials from the post-Angkorian period, when Pali Buddhism came to dominate cultural life in Cambodia. By narrative, I mean scenes sculpted or painted with sufficient detail to convey specific episodes in the historical Buddha's life story. I exclude from this definition a range of statuary representing the Buddha whose hand or bodily gestures may be interpreted by art historians today as representing this or that scene in the Buddha's life, but for which we do not have, in my view, sufficient bases for affirming such interpretation. It is more than likely that 20th century codification of mudras, for example, has obscured interpretations here and there in a range of ways. So what I show here are among the scenes of the historical Buddha's life story, privileged in bas-reliefs of the 12th to 16th centuries, and then in mural paintings of the modern period. The limited art historical evidence for narrative representation in the Cambodian post-Angkorian or middle period, and above all the very fact that there is such a paucity of material, is not easy to interpret. It may or may not mean that religious practice during that time emphasized other, possibly esoteric dimensions of Pali Buddhism, for instance, ritual practices in which practitioner bodies are brought into communication with the figure of the Buddha otherwise than through reading, commissioning, or otherwise knowing the linear narrative of the Buddha's life. I will return to questions of this sort of figuring of the Buddha in the second part of tonight's paper. This is also one point at which specificities of Cambodian art practices begin to emerge against the backdrop of the official pan-Theravadan universalist story. So returning to this story, let me note that discrete narrative episodes are most often part of a set, together rendering the Buddha's life story through its most celebrated or familiar moments. These distill the Buddha's life story, reducing it to, and thus revealing, perhaps constituting as such, its essentials. The scenes in question also serve as mnemonic devices for recollecting the narrative, and I will take full advantage of the situation in elaborating more fully on the illustrated episodes. As narrative, these material representations are, I will argue, on the side of the socio-historical, as opposed to or complementary to representations which can be said to performatively convey and enable certain forms of detachment from the socio-historical. The narrative materials draw from and contribute to the articulation of the heteronormative gender types which structured once Siddharta's Bildungsroman and social orders of the times and places in which they appear. The linear chronological development of the Buddha's life story is assimilable to lived experience of progression in mundane time. This is not to suggest that lived experience or Buddhist art are limited or reducible to linear representations thereof. Other temporal modes are at work in Buddhist art and practice, as I just suggested. It's rather to delineate this particular temporal dimension as it is emphasized in narrative materials. With reference to Bob Brown's work on narrative as icon, I'm not positing these images of the Buddha's life story as explicitly didactic. Their relations to the socio-historical, which I'm attempting to explore, are integral first to the narrative form of linear progress over a human life. Nor should my efforts to track episodes singled out in Cambodian art be taken as affirmation of any sort of seamless continuity in the interpretive experience of recurrent representation over time. The same scenes, seen here and there, may carry different meanings. Still, and still within the socio-historical prism, episodic recurrence, if not necessarily reflecting some absolute continuity, can function to temper change. This is a second register of relations between these representations of the Buddha's life story and the social order of the day. If they are not necessarily, at all times and places, wielded as pedagogical tools, they nonetheless structure collective thought of and in the socio-historical realm. One last note on what I'm trying to very roughly isolate as a socio-historical dimension of Buddhist art in Southeast Asia before I turn to my scenes in the story itself. The socio-historical, as I'm attempting to apprehend it here, encompasses a certain transcendence of itself, as paradoxical as that may seem. The Buddha famously leaves domestic life. Buddhist monks, and to some degree Buddhist nuns or other categories of female lay practitioners, do the same. But this religious practice of leaving the mundane behind itself remains integral to the social world. This tension where leaving the mundane is always already recuperated by the mundane is, I will argue, manifest in the gendered terms of Buddhist art that I will examine. So, I pointed at Roger. So 2 types of women emerge in the grand narrative. To quote Claire, there she is, I pointed next to you. To quote Claire with reference to contemporary Thai Buddhist social types, we see, and I quote here, the ideal model woman who is supposed to support a man's movement towards dharmic wisdom rather than pursuing it herself, contrasted with an image of a woman who leads a man astray through acting as an object of desire and therefore as a source of attachment to the material world. Unquote. Scholars tend to present these 2 types as contradictory. On the one hand, it is often noted, there is the positive female image, while on the other hand, there is the negative one. One of my concerns here will be to examine how these 2 go hand in hand. Veal insightfully notes the repressive nature of both social types. Let me add that both are enablers of the man on his path to enlightenment. Their apparent opposition is itself illusory insofar as they are mutually defined and function together to define the ideal man. In the sculpted stele found at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, Siddharta, the future Buddha, is born miraculously out of his mother's side. You will have seen him here. And so he neatly avoids any messy passage through the birth canal. It's an immaculate birth in other ways as well. In the womb, he had been encased in a precious chamber, sealed off from any impurities. The woman that you see on the right is Siddhartha's mother's sister. She is supporting her sister in giving birth. The double image foreshadows the sister's future role in raising the young boy following his biological mother's imminent death. Note that the newborn's sex is made perfectly apparent here by the thing that hides it. I don't know how clear it is for you all, but I can't really see from here. I don't know if the lights are dim enough. I'm just going to come up here and see if you can see it. Oh, yes. Siddharta is a boy, to be sure, which is not what can be said of him after he reaches enlightenment. Of the 32 marks of the enlightened Buddha figures the sheathed penis. The sheathed penis is a remarkable mark of the removal of a mark, which has, in my view, yet to be analyzed adequately in thinking through ways in which the figure of the Buddha is a site for thinking sexual difference. Given the immensity of this particular topic, I will not address explicit anatomical representation of the boys and the Buddha's sex or their sexes tonight, beyond noting this exemplary treatment of the little boy flying high out of his mother's side. At birth, Siddharta is fully formed, immediately taking 7 steps, lotus flowers blooming one by one underneath his falling feet. This image from a mid-20th century set of murals in Wat Kampong Thom, in Kampong Thom province in Cambodia, is exemplary of modern representation of the birth episode. The future Buddha's mother, named Maya, is as immaculate as her baby boy. An early version of Gautama's life story describes Maya in the following terms. A quote from the text. Her beauty sparkles like a nugget of pure gold. She has perfumed curls like the large black bee, eyes like lotus petals, teeth like stars in the heavens. Conception was immaculate as well, the miraculous boy first coming to his mother in a dream. During pregnancy, Maya famously remained chaste in thought and action. As mother, Maya is the condition of possibility of her son. He needs a body as a vehicle for birth, but not just any body. Having himself decided to enter Maya's womb to be born on earth, the future Buddha is effectively self-created or self-born, and in such needs a body that represents the repression of the body of a real woman in the flesh. In the operation, Maya is reduced to motherhood through and through. She is nothing more and nothing less than a platform for offspring. The idealization of Maya underpinning her son's illustrious career comprises a hyper-feminization manifest in her outward appearance and dependent upon an equally manifest eradication of sexuality. This version of femininity is defined by its pristine, immaculate nature, a pure vehicle for delivery of the male child, itself or herself untouched in the process. The ideal maternal woman can only be gained at the expense of the sexual one. Maya's story comes to us through motherhood and stops there. The newborn son's 7 steps are at once important for his future and for his mother's demise. She dies 7 days after giving birth. In other words, as soon as she is born a mother, she dies. And as the story moves along, the maternal will be elevated to a quasi-divine status. Siddhartha's mother dies to be reborn in Tusita, a heavenly realm from which she continues to act as a platform for her son's renown. Reborn in the Tusita realm, beyond the mundane, she is fixed in time as the beautiful mother born at her son's birth. Yet this elevation of the mother in life as in death does not counter social misogyny. In fact, it participates in it. Maya's allegorical register is otherwise apparent in her name, which means illusion. This is to say that despite her miraculous overcoming of sexuality to embody a desexualized femininity, she remains a woman. The quintessential woman equals illusion, and one of the morals of the story, announced in its opening scene and to be reiterated as the story progresses, is that woman, illusion, must perish for man to reach Buddhahood. If the illusory attraction of the sexual woman is first defeated in the body of the idealized mother, it is definitively revealed and extinguished in the figure of the dead woman. More than anything else, perhaps, the figure of the dead woman is wielded to enable Buddhist practitioners to see the illusory nature of attachment, quintessentially captured, as it were, in the form of sexual attraction. Maya, illusion, is the Buddha's mother. She literally gives birth to him. Without illusion, the Buddha would never have been. And as I said earlier, she is the condition of his possibility. But illusion is there to be dispensed with on the road to Buddhahood, or at least sublimated out of existence. It is key that the primeval Buddhist mother, pristine as she is also a dead mother. Dead in our realm, yet alive in another, she remains intact, untouched, as mother. The repression of Maya's sexuality in this image, fixed in time, of a beautiful mother who never ages, strangely foreshadows the female corpse's role as visual support for repressing sexuality at the core of monastic and lay practice. Let me approach this question of the meeting of the erotic and death, which is so variously developed in Buddhist practice, by returning to the conventional poetic image of female beauty, this time in the voice of an early Buddhist nun. It is in the same canonical terms of female beauty used to describe Maya, which I just gave you, that we hear early Buddhist nuns describing the feminine vanity they have relinquished. In the following verses, a nun rehearses the female ideal as a means of enabling detachment. The hairs on my head were once curly, black like the color of bees. Now, because of old age, they are like jute. It's just as the Buddha, speaker of truth, said, nothing different from that. In his introduction to the translation of these poems by early Buddhist nuns, Charlie Hallisey highlights the form in which this text appears. The poem is written in a meter meant to enhance the emotions of attraction and love, and follows the convention of describing a beautiful woman beginning with her hair. The tension between form and content is resolved in Hallisey's reading through the nun's palpable pleasure in seeing her degraded body. Written in the form of love, the poem does not evoke sadness at the epiphany of the illusion of female beauty. Instead, it evokes sensual exhilaration. Another nun opens her poem in adopting the voice of her son, addressing her. This is her son speaking in her voice. Whether up from the sole of the foot, mother, or down from the top of the head, reflect on this body as filthy and foul-smelling. Then she continues in her own voice. It is by living that way that all passion for sex is pulled out its burning fever broken, I have become cool, free. Giving expression to the sun's voice within, this nun challenges the conventional signification of women incarnating beauty in challenging the conventional poetic form of beauty by which a woman is described, from the head down. If the formulation reflects the power of phallocentrism by which women appear to freely submit to their own execution, it also contributes to freeing the writer from the social bonds in which such repression operates. She may be forever subject to the male voice, but at the same time, in adopting it, the nun is free. The cool sensation at seeing the body as filth is likewise sensually exhilarating. Frequently, the nuns adopt the Buddha's voice in speaking to themselves, as in the following. The name you are called by means calm, Upasama. You should cross the flood where death holds sway, hard as it is to cross. Take care of this body, it's your last, but make sure it doesn't become a vehicle for death after this. The maternal vehicle, which in the socio-historical register is the upshot of sexual encounter, is also the vehicle for death. The nun's overarching focus on the body is geared to eliminating it. Before moving on to the next scene, let me return briefly to the image of the double mother. Maya's sister is named Pajapati, literally one who has offspring, which we might translate as mother of all born beings. It is originally, as it were, the name of the Vedic creator god. Pajapati, too, is the quintessential mother, but as a mirror image of Maya, who dies and goes to heaven, she lives to support Siddharta in the earthly realm. Pajapati has most vividly lived on in Buddhist narrative as the first Buddhist nun. Her struggles to join the order and protesting her adoptive son's initial injunctions prohibiting women from doing so, along with the subordination to which she and her female cohort were subjected upon admission, illustrate well the mechanisms by which women who are not dead may access transcendence from the repressive social order, that is, only marginally insofar as the conditions of their access to the Buddhist order remain regulated within the social order itself. If Maya is remembered at once for being beautiful, dead, and reborn above, Pajapati is remembered for being ragged and dusty, yet alive, here on earth, knocking again and again at the Buddha's door to beg for admission, which is to say, for escape. Together, the two mothers embody the complexity of the mother figure as she contributes to figuring the Buddha. This is the antechamber of the great departure, when the Buddha finally resolves to leave the palace in search of he and we do not yet know what. This decision follows the birth of his son and a night of palace reveling sponsored by Siddhartha's father in a last-bid attempt to keep his son in the family fold. In the 16th century relief from Wat Nakor in Kampong Cham, Cambodia, we see the disheveled, slumping members of the harem under the upright Buddha figure. This is the harem down here. Siddhartha is repulsed by the sight of the women of the harem the morning after. To quote another Pali text, he sees, and I quote here, some of the women with saliva pouring out of their mouths, some with their bodies wet with saliva, some grinding their teeth, some talking in their sleep, some groaning. In fact, the text continues, what he sees when seeing the sleeping harem is, and I quote again, a charnel ground full of corpses scattered here and there. At this sight, Siddhartha decides to leave. Yet as he leaves, he sneaks a last glimpse of his wife and newborn child. Is this a moment of hesitation or a bold affirmation of the decision to leave? The second look, in any case, is the last before he mounts his horse. For 3 consecutive moments, reveling here, the harem is playing music. The sighting of the sleeping harem here, and then the sighting of the wife and child. Here's the wife with the child asleep, and Siddhartha pulling open the curtain to take a last look. So, and these are at the Ananda Temple in Pagan. We see them here represented in 3 separate consecutive plaques, 3 separate scenes. The decision to leave the palace life is textually and pictorially clinched by the sight of women. I think I have a close-up. So this down here is the sleeping harem, and which is seen, truly seen, which gives the insight of a charnel ground. Here's a lovely mid-century Cambodian mural painting of the scene, the harem scene, again from Wat Pom Thom. And another in this mural from Wat Vo Sa Riet in southern Vietnam. We have a common modern Cambodian composition in which the two scenes, seeing the harem and then seeing the wife and child, are depicted together over on the left here. The two visions would appear at first glance to be of opposite orders, the repulsive harem and the beautiful wife with child. Yet, as Maya illusion has shown us, and as this depiction insists, they are one and the same. The beautiful women of the harem appear as corpses. The newly born mother can only be allied with them in her beauty. The sighting of these women whose beauty is shown to be Maya, or illusion, gives the future Buddha decisive insight into the nature of women, and so to that of attachment to the worldly the beautiful woman represents, which is to say the sighting of women gives Siddharta insight into attachment, period, attachment in the absolute. So off he goes. The last life story scenes that I'll show you here are key sequences in the drawn-out moment of Siddhartha's enlightenment, when the prince who has abandoned home transformed into a Buddha, or the historical Buddha, over an intense night of meditation. This is the episode when the three daughters of Mara, the incarnation of evil or worldly attachment, not to be confused with Maya, seek to assist their father, who is vying for the future Buddha's throne. Bearing allegorical names, craving, discontent, and lust, the women wield their beauty to arouse passion in the meditating Siddhartha as a means of disrupting his progress to omniscience. So I have here two modern Cambodian renderings of the scene. First is this rather rare modern sculptural ensemble, which is modeled on the Thai posters, substituting for the murals in this very poor pagoda in southern Vietnam. And the second is this, also from Wat Pom Thom. The women envelop Siddhartha from below and from the sides. As in the Ananda Stele and like the Ananda Harem scene, they crowd or inhabit his pedestal. The future Buddha is unmoved. This one I couldn't resist. Temptation by Mara's daughters can be likened to the posters as omnipresent as Mara's daughters in modern Thai temples, or to the Vinaya, the canonical text on monastic discipline, in Janet Jatso's critical reading of sex and Buddhism. The Vinaya, Jatso notes, spends a lot of time and energy detailing precisely what sexual acts the monk should not accomplish. Her article might be said to haunt Charlie Hallisey, cited earlier on the poetic form adopted by an early Buddhist nun, insofar as the very form given to the repression of sexuality itself titillates. The first thing we are made to see on entering today's Thai temple is what we must not see. The female body must be put on display in calling for its erasure, and the very viability of the Buddhist order depends on it. As the night progresses, still unmoved, the future Buddha calls up the earth to fight the last great battle with Mara's full army. The earth is a goddess. Oh, sorry, the Buddha has been sculpted, chiseled out in this particular image. So the earth is a goddess who has witnessed the miraculous accomplishments of Siddhartha's past lives, the recollection of which serves as a sort of moral arm to confirm his right to the throne. The earth goddess also has a physical weapon, her long, wet hair, which she wrings out to drown those who would have attachment to worldly affairs reign. Let me take you through a series of representations of this scene, of which we have abundant ancient examples. It's a bit difficult to see. Here's the earth goddess. So most frequently, as you will have just seen, the earth goddess appears in the Buddha's pedestal. In many, the pedestal and or the earth goddess occupies a colossal space equal to, if not dwarfing, the Buddha himself. This is frequently also the case in modern representation, such as this. Assimilated with the pedestal, she is yet another condition of possibility for the Buddha to triumph. In literal and aesthetic terms, she is the ground, the earth, the pedestal, against which he figures. She fights his battle in this world such that he may transcend it. She is his counterpart, his opposite, his mirror image, but she is, at the same time, one with him. The pedestal is part and parcel of the figure from which it is nonetheless separated. What is of interest to me here is the anthropomorphization, or more precisely, the anthropomorphic feminization of the pedestal. Usually a pedestal is nothing. It is nondescript and must be so for the figure it supports to appear as a figure. At this crucial moment, however, the crucial moment in the Buddha's life story, the pedestal throne takes on monumental importance. Siddharta has it, Mara wants it, because whoever sits atop it reigns. As Siddharta transforms from worldly man to transcendent great man, the Sanskrit or Pali term is Mahapurusha, the pedestal transforms into a woman. Come back to these. Come back to one more of them, such as that. So this fronton and at least one of the other ones that I showed you a moment ago are particularly telling. The pedestal has been fully usurped by the female figure. While Mara's army stands on the ground, she stands on the pedestal, ultimately usurping even the Buddha's place. This is, of course, not the first time a pedestal has been assimilated with the feminine in Indic cultures, and we're dealing here with one manifestation of a complex cultural phenomenon. But what is striking here is that with the transformation of the male figure from worldly to transcendent, we also witness the transformation of the ground, the feminine condition of possibility, into a figure in her own right. One of the I meant to show you that one as well because it's so nice. And there's those two, where she takes on colossal form in the place of the Buddha. And here, this is one of the finest post-Angkorian statues. It's a small bronze figure of the earth goddess. She is among a handful of explicitly female sculptures in the round amongst the thousands of Buddha statues to have survived after Angkor. Now, the Buddha had the choice to stop the narrative of his life on earth here at enlightenment, but he decided to postpone entry into nirvana in order to teach for a spell. He is nonetheless now a transcendent figure wandering the land to spread those insights into reality which enable him to become detached from it. I will stop my account of his life story here to turn my focus instead to the staid figure of the Buddha. Once Siddharta becomes enlightened, his historical subjectivity, experienced and exposed as an artifice, is transformed and subsumed into the manifestation of a cosmic order. In the place of his self comes the paradoxical concept of the non-self. Thus, in the body of the Buddha, the ultimate realization of masculine domination meets its own deconstruction. The Buddha can be variously characterized in textual, visual, and ritual terms as hypermasculine, effeminate, feminine, binary, beyond binary. The figure of the Buddha becomes a site for exploration of the societal norms from which it has sprung. But even here, we can imagine the echo of an old feminist exasperation with postmodern deconstructions of subjectivity. Just when a powerful critique of phallocratic power becomes possible and promises a reconfiguration and redistribution of the relations between power and gender, subjectivity itself is hollowed out, in effect canceling any possible feminist boom from the maneuver. In the following, I will very rapidly address these questions through the prisms of a series of more or less feminine Buddha or Buddhist figures from Cambodia. In each, we see the transcendent body of the Buddha as a site of challenge to the social constraints Siddhartha's life story itself variously affirms. We also see the limits of possibilities on offer. Yes. So the earth goddess, in Khmer referred to as Nyingtodane, is the first of my figures. As I just suggested, Nyingtorni is the Buddha's Shakti, his other half, which makes him transcendent. In modern Cambodian practice, female spirits are thought to inhabit the pedestal. These are often called Barme, after the perfections, a series of moral and intellectual accomplishments the Buddha has made, and which have in turn made him into a Buddha. These feminine spirits, called Barme, are not always explicitly seen in the figure of Nyingtorni. They are there in the pedestal of any Buddha statue worthy of the name, even when Torni is not visually manifest. With or as the Barme, the earth goddess supports the Buddha, yet she also comes into her own with him. Her place is alternately subaltern in the pedestal and defying any simple relegation to the subaltern. As in any master-subaltern relation, the master is nothing without her. The pedestal can visually grow in importance, and she can emerge fully bodied from it. To what degree can we say, however, that she is not another iteration of the good woman, like the beautiful mother, who is also representative of woman as illusion? Nyingtorni's features are, in Cambodian art, those of conventional female beauty. Her role as water-bearer has lived on in the painterly conventions of the 20th and 21st centuries, which hold the perfect Cambodian woman to be holding a traditional water pot. But if this beautiful woman is paired with the Buddha in his moment of transcendence in the narrative sequence, she is also set up against Mara's daughters. Mara's daughters and Torni make for a second pairing akin to that between the Buddha's beautiful wife with child and the repulsive harem. The positive, beneficent Barme, residing in the pedestal of the central Buddha in Cambodian Vihara, are also known as malevolent female spirits, or Buddhae. They are the guardians of the temple who protect the Buddha such that he may do his important contemplative work. The assimilation of these animist spirits with Buddhist perfections is an instance of syncretism, of course, in which a complex image of male-female relations are produced. Despite her prominence and her promise, or perhaps because of it, Nyingtorni is a foil to the great man through the sexual binary the two construct, as well as through her persistent relation to the ground. She rises to prominence only as embodiment of the local, or the ground, whereas the Buddha sits on the pedestal as transcendent. Her emergence as figure is wholly grounded in the worldly. Her subjectivity is acquired at the moment subjectivity itself is renounced. If the Buddha may be said in some fundamental way to transcend sexuality as part and parcel of this crucial moment, Dharani remains a woman. The Freudian model is, I fear, with us here. It is precisely in resisting sexual temptation that the boy converts sexual energy into intellectual accomplishment, a process called sublimation. As for the girl, she is never made to resist sexual energy. There is nothing to overcome. She has nothing to lose. Her sexual energy is gently channeled into domesticity, rather than abruptly converted into the power of transcendence. Yet still, perhaps Nyingtorni can be considered an alternative mode of transcendence, whereby the feminine and the local is celebrated rather than suppressed. This is my Alpde. She is worshipped over here. You probably know which one I'm talking about. She is worshipped in an annex sanctuary at the Yusua Temple in central Cambodia. She sits with other Buddha figures, a crowned Buddha behind her, a robed stupa, and another seated Buddha at her side. She was once embodied in a fragment of an image of the Buddha protected by the Naga. When this picture was taken by anthropologist Tom Chulian in 1990, she had been given this new form. Maya Day is a proper name, which could be translated as mother hugging pregnant belly. She resembles a rather standard Buddha figure in Jhana Mudra, like the one to her right, and is draped in monastic robes. But the standard has been somewhat remodeled in her new form, particularly in the treatment of the head and the face. She is worshipped as a woman. Despite the modern innovation, she also remains a Buddha figure, but a female one. I plan to visit my Alpde next month, and in the meantime, I would simply like to put her in conversation with a few other images. And the first is this. In a gently mocking manner, Cambodians can address pregnant women as monks, asking where they are going or where they have gone to seek alms. It refers to the appearance of a monk when begging for alms, the bowl suspended by a shoulder strap under the robes and hugged at stomach level. This is an image from Pagan, where an image, and it's close-up on the right, where the seated Buddha has been shown to encase a smaller Buddha. It too might be taken to be an image of a pregnant Buddha. A number of such Buddhas encasing other, older ones, along with stupas encasing older stupas, are displayed as such in contemporary Burma. What are we to make of these feminized male figures? Firstly, we might remark that the Buddha, as well as the monks who emulate him in physical form and comportment, evince liminal sexuality. They can be feminine, and Mcurtin is by no means the only example of a Buddha figure to be worshipped as a woman in Cambodia. Through the figure of the enlightened Buddha, women can, in such, at least virtually, access transcendence from the social realm. We can say that the Buddha figure here embodies a female character or spirit, but we can equally say that a female figure gives body to the Buddha. As transcendent, the Buddha paradigmatically surpasses subjectivity. This may bring him beyond sexuality, but it can also open him up, as it were, to new sexualities. In the social realm, however, it is generally women who worship Mcurtin, and her worship is specifically oriented towards ensuring women's fertility. The other images that I juxtaposed here with that of Mcurtin likewise metaphorically endow the Buddha figure with power in pregnancy, which is to say feminine power irrevocably grounded in sexuality. Thus is illusion taking the rise and prominence of the earth deity one step further to make the Buddha a mother-to-be, represent empowerment of women. We might equally see it to render yet another form of repression of women on the order of a miraculous self-created one who decides of his own volition to enter his mother's womb, that is, he takes over her body. Let me put this image into dialogue with another I have worked on elsewhere, or these images were. This one. This is a 17th century Cham ancestral tablet from what is now Vietnam. It was interpreted by local Chams in the early 20th century as representing a legendary king, father, and son. Paul Moose proposed that the legendary Cham interpretation coincides with another epigraphically derived interpretation of the image of the king in the lap of the god Shiva. In the first instance, the son is a reduplication of the king who appears from the stone or linga. In the second, the king is a reduplication of the god appearing from the stone or the linga. The principle conveyed is one of seamless succession from god to king as from father to son. Note that there is no female intervention in this patriarchal lineage unless we were to consider the feminine pedestal facilitating the transaction. The encased images from Pagan are one iteration of a well-established principle in Buddhist art. In containing relics, a new Buddha image is made a successor to previous ones. It is enlivened and enlightened through this and other modes of ritual association, while the Buddha himself, as it were, is another iteration of previous Buddhas. Our female Buddhas comprise at once an acknowledgement, even a celebration of female bodily power, and a male usurpation thereof. In closing, I want to return to the theme of the two sisters with which I began, and which I began to explore over a year ago in my so-called inaugural lecture at SOAS, a ritual by which one's intellectual accomplishments, male or female, are supposedly confirmed. It is possible that what is beginning to appear in obsession with the two-sister theme is thoroughly subjective, having myself two daughters who are two sisters, to be sure. They are an exemplary pair, separating and reparating again and again. Two who are one and yet always two. They are themselves the impossible arithmetic that Derrida describes in Reading Siksu, Reading Sexual Difference, and I have missed them terribly over the past few weeks. But perhaps also, by virtue of my own subjectivity, I've stumbled onto an important theme in the thinking of gender that Buddhism does through the figure of the Buddha. This or these are Niang Chek and Niang Chom. They live in a small shrine in the town of Siem Reap, Cambodia, across from the royal residence. Niang Chek Niang Chom translates as Miss Chek, Miss Chom. They can also be called Pre Ong Chek, Ong Chom, or Pre Niang Chek, Pre Niang Chom, formulations in which their proper names are prefaced with the epithet Pre Ong, or just Pre, which is typically used for the Buddha or other divinities. In translation, this would give roughly August Lady Chek, August Lady Chom. They are a pair of sisters, an ensemble. They are considered as such. They are also statues of the Buddha, the so-called historical Buddha of Theravadan tradition. Nyingche Nyingchom are arguably the most important statues in Cambodia today. They are Palladia of the kingdom. I can't tell you when or why they took on such importance. Stylistically, they are post-Angkorian. Legend has it that they were commissioned by 2 royal sisters, which makes them today portrait statues. Insofar as the 2 commissioning sisters are assimilated with the Buddha, with the identity of the Buddha figures themselves. Together, they are said to have guarded the kingdom, fending off its enemies from within, men vying for the throne. They endow the local with the universal and vice versa, along with Nying Torni, Maya Day, Buddhist monks, and the Buddha him, or her, or itself. Nyingche Nyingchom stand as testimony to what happened to the female figure after the rich universe of ancient Khmer art, characterized by a wide range of male and female imagery, was displaced in post-Angkorian Theravada in Cambodia with the single figure of the Buddha dominating the artistic landscape. They are standing here against the backdrop of the Buddha's life story. They are also standing up against it. This is my send-off. I will leave you with 2 more images, which I have prepared as 2 more sisters in the Buddha. For want of time and also, no doubt, for want of your patience, I will not comment on these artists or their art other than to say that they give me promise. While the social constraints evinced in the Buddha's life story remain alive as ever, here and there, so do explorations of the possibilities for challenging these constraints continue to be made in the name of the body of the Buddha. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.